So this year, we are, as you know, studying through corporate worship or congregational worship, what the church does when it comes together, why does it do it, so forth. And this particular month, we looked at, a couple of weeks ago, spent a Sunday morning and a Sunday night looking at what God desires for singing and worship. That is, its goal to teach and admonish and to do all those different things. And we spent some time there. And so this morning is kind of a spin-off of that particular subject for many reasons, one of which is the churches of Christ have been known for a number of things throughout the years. Whether some of those things are fair or not doesn't really matter. But one of the things that the churches of Christ have been known for is a rejection of instrumental music in worship. Okay? That is, we sing what is known as acapella. Okay? Now, the question is, why is that? And so a lot of people have those questions. A lot of people who are members of the church still have a lot of questions. And so I thought it would be a good time, since we'd already focused on singing, to just kind of talk through this and study through this issue together. Now, when people say, the churches of Christ, you don't believe in music or you don't use instruments, and listen, when someone says you don't believe in music, they don't really mean you don't believe in music. Because obviously we just sang, that's music, okay? What they mean is you don't believe in musical instruments. So sometimes I've seen people get into arguments over that. That's not worth a fight, okay? But what if I were to tell you that if you scanned the history of the church for 2,000 years, that it is the people who sing a cappella in worship who are the ones that through the majority of the years have only done that, and that the instruments are relatively recent additions? What if I told you that amongst people who claim Christianity to this day, that there are, outside of the churches of Christ, 250 million people who claim to follow Christ who will not worship with an instrument in their particular assemblies? So one of the things I want us to understand is this. I understand a lot of people frame this as an issue that just the churches of Christ have. But what I hope to do is kind of broaden our horizon a little bit to see that this is not solely some kind of a Church of Christ issue. That this is something that's been discussed through the millennia of Christianity. Now, what we're also hoping to do as we discuss this is we have to work at erasing this hostility that exists between people who disagree. Okay? And learning to have open dialogue and conversation. Right? And so there are certainly going to be people, obviously, in this room who will agree with the assessment that we give this morning and tonight. There will be other people who will not agree with it. Okay? The only thing that we can ask of each other is that what we do as we have that discussion, we have it with sincerity, and that we both understand that we desire to please God in what we're doing. Okay? And so as we think through this, we need to make sure we think through it correctly. Now, what we're going to do as we study this is we're going to study this the way we would any subject. We're going to look at the Old Testament usage of it. We're going to look at the New Testament usage of it. We're going to look at church history and see how that kind of played out, how things developed to the point of where we are. And then we're going to make some analysis of that information. And so what I want to do this morning is just talk biblically very quickly from the Old and New Testaments. And then I want us to spend some time historically examining. And I will tell you that in the historical analysis of this, I'm going to have a number of quotes up on the screen, okay? And that may not be the most scintillating way for you to study, but I don't know how else to pass on the information for your consideration other than that, okay? So, as we think through this, number one, let's think through it biblically. What does the Bible say about music just broadly, whether instrumental or not? Okay? In the Old Testament first, it has been compiled, that it's been counted that there are at least 20 different instruments of music in the Old Testament, okay? 20 different instruments, whether it's the harp or the lyre or a cymbal or a drum or tons of different instruments. Now, the origins of music come in Genesis 4 and verse 21 when the descendants of Cain invent those instruments, okay? Now, that's in no way talking about worship in that setting. That's just saying man became musically inclined, man developed these instruments to express himself musically. Part of music is just part of the way God has made us and its expression. So it begins in Genesis chapter 4. At least that's when we're told of it. Okay? We also knew that they used instruments in the Old Testament to celebrate victories. For an example, in Judges 11 and verse 34, when Jephthah comes back, you remember Jephthah made the foolish vow, but he comes back as a victor, and his daughter runs to meet him, singing and playing a tambourine. And so they were, and these are just, by the way, one example. Many of these could be piled up on top of each other. All right? It was also used during a time of rejoicing. Isaiah speaks of that. The people are rejoicing while they're rejecting God. But the underlying premise of that statement is the people used them in times of rejoicing the same way we play music in times of rejoicing. Okay? It was also used in times of sadness. Job describes his sadness as saying, my harp and my lyre, those instruments that celebrate mirth and gladness, have now become sadness for me. Okay? And then finally, in the Old Testament, it was used in religious festivals. When God delivered the people of Israel from Assyrian captivity, which we're coming up on in Wednesday nights as we study the Kings, Hezekiah said, we will sing to you in the house of the Lord using stringed instruments all the days of our lives. Okay? And so one of the things that we need to be really clear on as we think about this, okay? The first is there have been a group of people, and many of them have, I think, been influenced by Adam Clarke's commentaries on this subject, but a number of them believe that instruments were not sanctioned by God in the Old Testament. I think it's hard to read the Old Testament and walk away with that conclusion, okay? Matter of fact, I would argue just the opposite. I believe that God actually commanded instruments to be used in the Old Testament, okay? And let's look at a couple of these as we send them. In 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 25, this is a time of restoration under King Hezekiah. And listen what is said here. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the commandment of David and of Gad the king's seer and of Nathan the prophet. All three of those men are prophets, Nathan, Gad, and David. All of them speak for God. Okay? For the commandment was from the Lord through his prophets. They're using instruments in their worship at the temple, and God is commanding them to use it and which ones they are to use. Okay? So I find it very hard to try and make an argument that says God didn't sanction them in the Old Testament. I mean, that's just denying what the text is saying. Okay? The other thing would be this. The instruments were used as praise. Okay? Now, that will become a little more important tonight when we discuss some of the objections that people make, some of the considerations that they have when you talk about acapella singing. But one of them is that it's an aid. But what this text says in 1 Chronicles chapter 23 is that the instruments themselves were made for praise. Okay? That they were made for praise. The instruments actually praised. Okay? Now, again, hopefully tonight that will become a little bit more significant as we walk through. Okay? Now let's move to the New Testament. The New Testament, you see instruments used in a lot of different ways. Matthew 9 and verse 23, when the daughter has died and they have people playing on their instruments in their funeral service as they get ready to bury her. Or it's used in entertainment. It's used in Matthew 11 and verse 17 to describe how John the Baptist, it's like kids playing in the street saying, we have played on the harp for you or the lyre for you, and you have not danced. Okay? So it has an entertainment element, or you might look at like Luke 15, where the older brother draws near and he hears music and dancing. Okay? So it's used in an entertainment type form, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of God's goodness to us in creation. It's also just considered to be a basic part of life. So in Revelation 18 and verse 22, when he describes the downfall of Babylon and even in downfall of Rome, in many other places also in the Old Testament, it says that when you pass by that city, you'll no longer hear the sound of music because the city has been rendered desolate. Okay? So music is part of the everyday experience of culture. All right? It's also used, instruments are also used to make illustrations. What did Paul say in 1 Corinthians 13? Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal or a clanging cymbal. Cymbals that you crash together, and it produces a noise. You see them in bands, you see them in other places. And so they're used in, instruments are used in the New Testament in these particular ideas. Now, the thing that makes it a little bit peculiar when we look at instrumental music in the New Testament, especially in its reference to worship, okay, there is zero denial in Revelation chapter 5, and we'll deal with these texts a little bit more tonight. In Revelation 5, in Revelation 14, in Revelation 15, there is a mention of the harps of God in the worship to God in heaven, okay? Not on earth, but in heaven. Now, I will say, be cautious about taking Revelation literally, okay? Because, for an example, in Revelation 5 here, in this same text, he talks about bowls of incense, and then he tells you, but I'm not really talking about incense. I'm really talking about the prayers of the saints. So, if you take the harp idea from Revelation 5 in heaven and you press it onto things that we should do in worship today, you're going to run into some interpretive issues. I'm going to say that to say the least, okay? But as I said, we'll talk more about that tonight as we walk through it. Now, when it comes to on earth, the mention of instruments in worship to God on earth in the New Testament, there's not a verse that exists. Okay? This is not just my assessment. This is actually the assessment of another. Well, this is not going to be good if that won't work. Ms. Debbie, you mind going ahead to the next one? This next statement is by Robert Godfrey, who is the president and professor of church history at Westminster Seminary in California. And he says, nowhere in the New Testament church are instruments clearly used for worship. What he means by that is you cannot find a text in the New Testament where an instrument is employed in the worship of God, save the ones that take place in heaven in Revelation 5, 14, and 15, which have their own interpretive things that we'll deal with tonight. Okay? That's his assessment of what is going on. Now, here's the thing. And this is the thing that we ought to think about just a little bit. As we said, the Old Testament instruments are everywhere in their worship to God. It's clear. It's hard. I mean, you just have to deny what's in the text to say that. So, if you see them everywhere in the Old Testament and you come to the New Testament and then you don't see anything anywhere, it's, as one writer put it, that silence is kind of deafening. If it's so prominent in the Old Testament, why in the New Testament would that change? That you couldn't find anything anywhere. Furthermore, as we said in the Old Testament, in 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 25, God commanded through 3 prophets, David and Gad and Nathan, to use instruments in the worship of God at the temple. So you have an Old Testament command to use instruments in your worship. The question that I have is, why don't we see anything similar to that in the New Testament? Whether you agree with the assessment or not, it should cause everyone to stop and think and ponder that question. If it's so prevalent then, why is it so absent in the New Testament? Okay? Something to think through. All right. So now what I want us to do is to work through the historical case. And what we're going to do, now, as we get into all this, all the caveats apply. Church history is not authoritative, okay? That is, you can't look at the second century church and say, they did it, therefore that's what we should be doing. I mean, in some cases, you can't even look at the first century church and do that, right? You ever read 1 Corinthians? They're committing fornication. We can commit fornication. No. Okay? So that's not what we're dealing with here. But church history is helpful in understanding, getting to your present condition, your present understanding of things, and also it's helpful to see how they viewed. You see, these people that lived in the second century, it's very likely that they knew apostles themselves. And so, how did they understand what it was that the New Testament said at that time? Okay? Now, some of the individuals that I'm going to give you in quotations as we think through this, these men are leading scholars in their particular field. One of them is, two of them are members of the Churches of Christ. The rest of them are not. They span all over the board, from Anglican to Baptist to Presbyterian to a number of different belief systems. Okay? And so I want us to just think through and see what's going on here. And I want to try and, again, impress upon our minds, because a lot of people are shocked when they start reading some of these statements. Okay? So the early church, the first statement is by Dr. Andrew McGowan, who is an Anglican priest. He is the head of the theology department in the divinity school at Berkeley in California, a guest lecturer at Yale. And he's written a book. He's emphasizing the first 4 centuries of Christian practice. This is what he says. The fact that Christian music was predominantly a vehicle for uttering words of praise may help explain an evident lack of positive interest in instrumental music among Christian writers. What is he saying? None of them talked about it. None of them entertained the idea of using an instrument in worship. Okay? And this comes from a giant set of books called The History of the Church, or the Church Fathers, where you have Ante-Nicene and the Post-Nicene Fathers, and it covers about the first 600 years of early Christian thought after the New Testament. Okay, he also says this, Andrew McGowan again, explicit treatment of instrumental music, that is where the instrument is actually mentioned. A discussion comes up in the documents about instrumental music. This is what he says. By Christian writers comes fairly late, from the 4th century and after. That is, nobody talks about instrumental music, especially as it is addressed in worship in the first 4 centuries. Why don't they? That's the question we need to be asking. Okay? So he says this, the tone of such discourses about actual music, when it is finally clear that real instruments are the issue, is universally negative. Instruments and the music they produce are rejected with vigor. That is, with passion. They are utterly in opposition to it. Okay? Granted, those associations with idolatry and immorality may be some of that, but that's not the way, in his assessment, that's not exactly what they were driving at. Okay? Further, here's Dr. Everett Ferguson. He is a research professor of early church history, or was before he passed away a few years ago at Abilene Christian in Abilene, Texas. His assessment, the testimony of early Christian literature, is expressly to the absence of instruments from the church and from approximately the first 1,000 years of Christian history. You can't find it. Okay? Here's another. Here's James McKinnon, a professor of music at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. These are his words. The antagonism which the fathers, talking about the early church fathers or leaders, of the early church displayed toward instruments has 2 outstanding characteristics. Their opposition has 2 characteristics. Vehemence, they are absolutely 100% against it, and uniformity, and they all agree on that. This is not my assessment. These are people who are specialists in their field, who have dedicated their lives to studying that first 600 years of church history and every one of those documents, not only in English, but in Latin, the language in which they were written. Okay? So that's the early church. That first 600 to 1,000 years of the early church, they didn't want anything to do with it. Okay? Now, there were pocket elements. There was a pope who tried to introduce some things, but he was met with such opposition in the 800s that he gave it up. He wouldn't even try and push it any further. Okay? So now let's go to the church in the Middle Ages, around from about 1000 to roughly 1500 or so. All right? This is Robert Godfrey, who is also a research professor. He says, in the worship of the church, it appears that for almost the first 1,000 years of its history, no instruments were used in Christian worship. We saw that with Ferguson as well. Joseph Bingham, who was a 19th century church historian, he said this: music in churches is as ancient as the apostles, but instrumental music not so. For it is now generally agreed among learned men that the use of organs came into the church since the time of Thomas Aquinas, who was a very famous Catholic theologian, a very intelligent man, and has a lot of beneficial writings. Around 1250 or 1300. That's actually the first time that instruments start making an appearance in Christian worship. It was around 1300. And it became pretty popular for about 200 years up until about 1500. Okay? That's what the historical analysis of everything that we have. Now, here's another statement. Dan Chambers, who is a member of the church, he says, not only did instruments start showing up in worship with increasing regularity in the 1300s, but historians also report that by the early 1500s, organs had become a fixture in almost every important church building in Europe. Keep in mind, of course, that this all happened in the Roman Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was the only game in town. That is, that's when the Catholic Church had its stronghold on Europe. You didn't have other belief systems. You just had the Catholic Church. And they had authority, not just in church, but they had authority by the government to do these things. All right? Then the Reformation comes. The Protestant Reformation comes. Let's see what we got here. Timothy George, who is a research professor at Beeson Divinity School at Samford in Birmingham. He says the Catholic authorities were shocked at the rigor with which Huldrych Zwingli, who was a very influential reformer, probably the third most influential, and that he pursued his reforms. In 1527, the organ at the great minster was dismantled and removed, despite the fact that Zwingli was an accomplished musician on multiple instruments. He tore it apart and drug it out. He didn't want it there. John Calvin, a lot of Presbyterian roots with him. Of course, the doctrine of Calvin, or the belief of Calvinism, is influenced by his teaching. He's a very significant figure in church history. He says, to sing the praises of God upon the harp and the psaltery are unquestionably formed parts of the training of the law, talking about the Old Testament, and of the service of God under that dispensation of shadows and figures, but they are not now used in public thanksgiving. We are not indeed forbidden to use in private musical instruments, but they are banished out of the churches by the plain command of the Holy Spirit, when Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 lays it down, an invariable rule that we must praise God and pray to Him only in a known tongue. Now, I think Calvin may be misusing 1 Corinthians 14:13 in my opinion, okay? But it shows you he believed it, okay? I'm not necessarily agreeing with his exegesis of 1 Corinthians 14:13, but he did believe it, okay? John Price, another professor, said the Protestant reformers showed unrelenting zeal to remove the idolatrous practices introduced by the Roman Catholic Church. Look, I know my time is already basically done here. They're all saying the same thing in the Reformation. The Puritans, they rejected it. And as he says, it's not because they disliked music. They loved the religion of Christ's ordinances more. What about the Restoration movement? Churches of Christ, the Christian church, the disciples of Christ. What about it? Well, the instrument was introduced in Midway, Kentucky, a melodeon, Midway University still has it in their library that you can see. And there were many things that happened, but a split took place in 1906 in a religious census, and that's where you started to see a big distinction between Churches of Christ and the Christian church. If you've read Jack's book that he's given to us, you know that this congregation actually used to be called Moulton Christian Church. Okay? That was before a split happened that divided Churches of Christ and the Christian church. They made a formal split and made that legal. Okay? Earl West describes this. He's a professor, or was before he passed away, of the Restoration movement in the southeastern United States. And this is what he said, one of the many things he has said about instrumental music in Churches of Christ. He said, "And so division came to the Restoration movement. In some respects, it was a strange procedure. No one ever sat down to devote hours of biblical study to the issue, only to come away with the conviction that God wanted his people to use the instrument, and unless they did, they could not please him. No one ever accepted the instrument because driven by a divine compulsion to do so. It was adopted because it fitted comfortably into a religious society structured around denominational styles and patterns of thought." That's his assessment. Okay? Here are a few people who are famously opposed to instrumental music. Charles Spurgeon, one of the most gifted minds of the 19th and 20th century. I mean, gifted. Preached in London to thousands of people every week. Well-noted Baptist preacher. His books are available. They're tremendous. I have a lot of them. But he says, if you skip down into the quote, it says, "The refined niceties of a choir or the blowing off of wind for an inanimate bellows and pipes, we might as well pray by machinery as praise by it." When he was the preacher at the Metropolitan Tabernacle, they sang Acapella every Sunday. John Wesley, this statement is disputed. No one can actually find it. Adam Clarke makes this statement in his commentary, so we can't verify it 100%. But Adam Clarke says that he was opposed to it. Adam Clarke himself, the famed commentator, was opposed to it. Now, Adam Clarke makes this statement in a commentary of Amos chapter 6 and verse 5, and I don't agree with his exegesis of Amos 6:5. Okay? But it does show that he himself stood against it. All right? And on we could go. Historically today, you have Amish who are against it. You have Mennonites. You have splinter Baptist groups that are very much against the use of instruments in their worship. And you also have the Eastern Orthodox churches, which are 250 million in number, who are opposed to the using of instruments in worship. So, what then is the point of all this? Well, first of all, I'm hoping that whatever your belief on the subject is, I'm hoping that you are seeing things that actually aren't advertised very much. That when you sit down to study a subject, you have to do so thoroughly. And what the emphasis of church history says is that there have been two pockets where the instrument was embraced by people who followed Jesus. In the Middle Ages of 13 to 1500, and then about the late 1700s up until present. So if you look at the majority of church history, which again is not an authority, it doesn't decide what's right and wrong. I'm simply saying, if you look at it, the majority of Christians throughout history have stood against the use of instruments in worshiping God. That's what the history says. The Bible itself does not speak clearly about them. As far as the New Testament, there's no mention of an instrument being used in the worship of God. Those are facts. Okay? So let me hasten to make this point as we get done here. This is not about one group of people being more sincere than another group of people. This is not about one group of people being smarter than another group of people. This is just about looking at evidence. That's all it is. And with the evidence that I have in front of me, as limited as it may be, there are way too many things that really make me cautious on this issue. The fact that you have an Old Testament command and you don't have a New Testament one. The fact they're everywhere in the Old and they're nowhere in the New. The fact that Christians throughout the ages have said, that's not what God wants us to do. What I hope you will do, and what I have tried to do throughout this week, is to simply look at the evidence. It doesn't matter what I was taught. It doesn't matter what I'd always believed. It was just, what's the evidence? Now each of us has to decide, and tonight we'll deal with some other questions, as we said. But whatever we do before God, we need to know why we do it. We don't need to do anything because that's what we've always done. We need to do what we do because we have consulted Scripture and history and tried to really understand the issue and forget traditions. This morning, the wonderful news is that Jesus died for us all, so that we have the opportunity to offer our worship to Him. If we will come to Him with a penitent faith, confessing Christ, to be baptized in water for the forgiveness of our sins, becoming New Testament Christians, or maybe as New Testament Christians we haven't been faithful, maybe we're struggling with other things, maybe that's something we have an opportunity now to come and to obviously let people know that we're struggling. We can pray together, we can do that privately, whatever it is. We just want to make sure everybody gets the help that they need. And we want to make sure, even on this subject this morning, that we have open, fair, and honest conversations. Because I know you want to please God, and I know I want to please Him. So if we can help you this morning, that's what we want to do as we stand and sing this song.